And hey everyone, welcome back to our ongoing coverage here in Post-Communist Transition. This lecture is going to be a good one because it touches on a subject that spans Southeastern Europe to examine the potential problems in democratic transition within multi-ethnic societies. Now, many of you might be thinking to yourself, a multi-ethnic society should in and of itself be democratic. It should be inclusive. There should be some all-encompassing sense of collective group identity that spans religious, linguistic, racial, or cultural differences and idiosyncrasies. And if you think that, well, congratulations, you're living in an advanced society. But in many cases, countries that are transitioning from authoritarian rule, especially those that are undergoing some form of state fragmentation, like what happened in the former Yugoslavia, provides an additional set of challenges. And that is, with new states that are forming, new borders, new regional identities that are now becoming national identities, what to do with sizable minority communities that suddenly find themselves living in a country that they didn't support, and potentially becoming second-class citizens based on different linguistic, religious, cultural, ethnic, or other identities that go against the new constitutional framework of a country that identifies a certain group, a certain nation, as the primary citizens of that country. And this is something that took place not just across the disintegrating Yugoslavia, but also within Bulgaria, Romania, and to a lesser extent Albania, just largely because the minority communities there were not as large. But if you take a look at this map here, right, you kind of see, the color-coded identification of certain ethnic groups that span the internal federal borders of these countries. So suddenly Serbs find themselves as sizable minorities in an emerging Croatian and Bosnian state. Albanians, which make up the overwhelming majority within the Serbian province of Kosovo, also begin to feel not just alienated by growing Serbian nationalism, but mobilized on their own by a sense of injustice that has been denied Albanian self-determination since the First and Second Balkan Wars of the early 20th century. Then, of course, is the question of what exactly is a Montenegrin and how is that different from that of Serbs? What about Macedonians? Are Macedonians a separate identity from that of Bulgarians? And suddenly you begin to realize that challenges to democratic consolidation are much more prominent in societies that are pluralistic than those ethnically homogeneous ones of Central Europe. So the thing to look for, and this goes beyond understanding just Southeastern Europe. We can find elements of this within the Middle East, within Southeast Asia, even now today within some former countries of the Soviet Union. We note that a minority community is one that possesses a sizable, collectively conscious, politically active, and externally supported set of identities. Right? So a minority is more than just a small group of people that just find themselves not going along with the prevailing sociocultural attitudes of the majority, but in this case, they also can look to external national homelands. So if it's Hungarians within Romania, we note that there is some support, some institutional support for their autonomy and their cultural rights coming from Hungary. For Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia, that is going to be coming from Serbia proper. From Albanians within Kosovo, that is going to come from Albania. For Croats in Bosnia, that is going to come from Croatia, right? So you sort of get the understanding here that minorities are not just simply small, isolated, aggrieved, and harassed groups, but they can also fight back, sometimes physically fight back. So the understanding of a minority raises questions about the concept of citizenship and belonging in newly democratizing states, which should seem self-evident to just normal practitioners of structural democracy. But when we think about citizenship and we ask who is part of this newly emerging state, and who are discarded as subordinate communities, Again, for countries that are based more on civic notions of national identity, that question seems to be pretty self-evident that everyone that lives here and pays their taxes and follows the laws and does what needs to be done, are considered equal citizens. But in some countries, simply by being a different identity doesn't justify the expulsion of this group, although ethnic cleansing has certainly happened in the Balkans and elsewhere. But even at the emergence of these new states, it is clear that groups that previously enjoyed some privileges and mobilities in the old authoritarian order now find themselves somewhat limited in what they can do, what they can say, and where they can go. So who belongs and who doesn't becomes much more prominent and much more discriminatory, especially when primary states will extend the same degree of rights and privileges to their own ethnic groups that live as minorities in neighboring countries. So, for instance, within Croatia, a Croatian national that lives in Bosnia has all the voting rights and privileges of a Croatian citizen living in Croatia, and oftentimes is seen as more important than the remaining Serb minority that lives within said country. So inclusiveness goes beyond just state boundaries to also include more ethnic and cultural in that sense. And this leads us also to examine the importance of the lack of narratives of cultural inclusion and civic society, right? It tends to be somewhat naive of us to think that when countries are transitioning to democracy, everything is just going to be wonderful. All you have to do is just apply some constitutional rule of law and everybody benefits. That's not always the case. In fact, more often than not, that's not the case. What we find is that democratic political culture will favor one group over another. But if the country, as we saw in Central Europe, tends to be ethnically homogeneous, right? The minorities are statistically insignificant. Well, these things tend to be overlooked, right? We don't really tend to see this as problematic. But when the minority is sizable enough to be, electorally present in some cases, especially if they make up the majority of one geographic area, well, then these, narratives of ethno-chauvinism and the lack of inclusiveness becomes much more problematic, right? And this risks not only excluding minorities from the new country, but alienating them to a degree in which they take some kind of reactionary measure, right? Which can range from, everyday dissidents to, more formal and organized struggles for regional autonomy, or even outright self-determination, right? So it's more than just simply pointing out a minority and saying, oh, poor them, they're being harassed. A lot of times these minorities will see the writing on the metaphoric wall and take courses of action to effectively either counter these measures or seek to solidify their strength, their institutional strength within a particular area, right? That's why we see pushes for autonomy, secession, irredentism across the region. It has nothing to do with ancient hatreds. It has much more to do with the decisions that are made by political actors at the time these new states are forming in the late 80s and early 90s. So, this gives us an opportunity to look at the relationship between post-communist transition and ethno-nationalism. It existed, to be sure, as I've been mentioning, in Central Europe, but it's much more prominent in Southeastern Europe because of the heterogeneity. And the first thing that we can note here is the concept of constitutional nationalism, which is a type of ethno-nationalism that is enshrined within the new constitution of a country that clearly privileges one group of people over another. And while it doesn't necessarily discriminate verbally against one group, it's clear after reading the text that some groups are going to be favored more than others. One great example of this is the Croatian Constitution of 1991. This is where constitutional nationalism really comes from. And the Croatian Constitution effectively says that Croatia is the home of the Croatian nation. right, of the Croatian peoples. Now, you could think that this was an all-encompassing inclusion of whoever lives in Croatia is now considered to be Croatian itself, like, American. But Croatian is a specific ethnicity, one that was pushed throughout the late 80s to, specify a certain dialect within the Serbo-Croatian language, a specific alphabet that was going to be used, the Latin alphabet over the Cyrillic, various cultural symbols of Croatian heritage that is clearly ethnically favoring Croats over Serbs, Hungarians, and others. And when this is also mentioned in the Constitution that all Croats around the world can look to Croatia as their home, this privileges them over a then sizable Serbian minority that is sitting there wondering, well, what about us? And even though, let's say, Serbs in Croatia did not exclusively use the Cyrillic alphabet, once it became clear that there was going to be one alphabet used over another and no mention of dual use, once it was going to be known that Croatian history books were going to look at a history that was clearly Croatian-oriented, which downplayed, right, the victimization, the suffering of Serbs in the Second World War, and also tried to undermine the concept of multi-ethnic inclusivity that was part of Yugoslavia, then these things begin to pile up and the Serb community begins to feel alienated, discriminated against, especially when many Serbs start losing their jobs in certain key areas because they need to be given to Croats instead of Serbs. So in this sense, constitutional nationalism is a way of legally enshrining the predominance of one group at the expense of another. And, this kind of leads to what we, in the political science and the, political cultural disciplines call the othering of minorities. It's not a great word, but it gets the point across, right? The othering of minorities by suddenly drawing some kind of line between those that get all the privileges of being part of this new state and those that are going to be, at absolute best, second-class citizens, right? If you're lucky, you get a couple of ethnographic folk dances and cook-offs. That's basically it. But the school curriculum, the national symbols, the official historical memory are all going to favor one group over another. And this othering of minorities runs the risk of turning them into scapegoats for problems in the country. Certainly, they're cast as fifth-column elements, especially if, they can point to a neighboring country for support. They're now seen as, outside agents or disloyal citizens or people with dangerous tendencies of upending the internal stability of the country, right? So, othering of minorities is more than just simply subordinating them in the state, but it's turning them into potential problems, right? Potential antagonists for state stability. And if the primary group, right, appropriates a political culture of history, memory, and identity that favors one group over another, and at the same time tries to replace existing narratives of inclusiveness that was, by and large, indicative of Yugoslav history, then we're going to see that widening between these groups more and more, right? Especially within the deliberate appropriation of official state languages, alphabets, religions, and other elements, as I've been talking about. These symbols, which could be seen as, just natural for the predominant group, especially if the country in question is seen as the homeland of that group, is going to, by and large, be considered, I think most likely carelessly, by not noting that there are other people within the country. But there's also political actors in the country that have absolutely no problem alienating these minorities in the hopes that they might realize that this is no longer a place for them. And if they decide to up and leave and move to their kin country, well, hey, I'll gas up the bus for you, right? In a way, the more hardliners are more than happy to see an aggrieved minority realize that they're no longer welcome, and they're going to move to move just simply across the border. This is not necessarily particular to Croatia, as I've been mentioning with constitutional nationalism. By, let's say, the late 80s, definitely 91, 92, each of these constituent republics had been actively involved in replacing multi-ethnic memories of Yugoslavism with some kind of ethno-national centrism. So it happens in, everywhere from Slovenia all the way down to Macedonia, right? The idea of Yugoslavism was an outdated concept. The whole notion of brotherhood and unity is no longer valid among new generations of people. And, in particular, I have to single the two groups out. The Croats of Croatia and the Albanians of Kosovo were absolutely adamant in deconstructing this, what they considered a false myth of Yugoslavism, and even went to the extent in saying that Yugoslavia was really greater Serbian nationalism, just simply in covert form. That's not entirely true, right? Yugoslavism was very much multi-ethnic and all-encompassing, and at the same time was largely embraced, not just within Serbia, but also within Bosnia, Macedonia, and Montenegro. So to suggest that Yugoslavism was just Serbian centrism is just one of those narratives that nationalists within Croat and Albanian circles wanted you to believe. But be that as it may, right? If the concept of Yugoslavism was breaking up, other groups were going to eventually follow suit and say, well, no one's following this. We have to effectively look out for our own. And there is certainly a major role to play with this through organized religion. But here I have to talk about the institution of religion, not religion itself. Right? There's a temptation among certain people to think that religion is divisive, it's racist, it's nationalistic. More often than not, when religion comes into the debate on political culture, theology and dogma never, ever, ever enter into the equation. Right? Religion in this sense is really in the form of national churches. Whether they be Orthodox or Catholic churches within Serbia, Romania, Croatia. I mean, we talked about the role of the Catholic Church in Poland in providing ready-made symbols, myths, historical memories, collective identities to counter that of the communist narrative. This is no different in the Balkans. The Serbian Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church in Croatia were instrumental in not just chipping away at the concept of Yugoslavism, but bringing up memories from the past in which one group systemically targeted and harassed the others. And even in the absence of any kind of ethno-chauvinism, these churches, and this also goes for Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Greece didn't go communist, but it's the same type of thing. They all serve as sources of national symbols, values, beliefs, and memories. So this is like, a ready-made starter kit for asserting the ethnic centrism of one group of people over another. Now, within this sense, right, the role of religion doesn't necessarily have to be confrontational. A lot of times, religion, a renaissance of religion within a crumbling Yugoslavia also provided some kind of counterbalance to years of political and economic turmoil. So as the country was disintegrating from within and political ineptitude and national animosities were running rampant, there was a very small period in time in the 90s and the 2000s where many people looked to religion as a source of solace, as a way of going off the grid. And what we find particularly in Serbia, Romania, even Greece at the time, just because of the changing political climate, was this so-called retreat to the monasteries, right? People in their 20s, their 30s, people who had, advanced degrees in academia, they were professionals in the real world. They kind of decided to use religion as a way of just giving up on the materialism that just led to problems and conflicts. And people just, went to the monasteries. They, became monks, or they decided to live ascetic lives here. So the point here is that religion isn't necessarily confrontational so much as it provides this, cultural alternative for a declining communist Marxist ideology that no one is really following anymore. But still, at the same time, we need to note that multi-ethnicity can be used very potently for division and sowing the seeds of paranoia. So this little image here, this photo of a graffiti thing in the eastern Croatian town of Vukovar, is reflective of a more recent series of events in which, and this is long after the wars of Yugoslavia had ended, towns in Croatia that could produce a Serbian minority of 30% or more. I think it's like 30% or 1/3 of the population, whatever it happens to be, right? These towns are required to have all their official signs in both quote-unquote Croatian and quote-unquote Serbian. Now, for those who know Serbo-Croatian, the differences between Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian are about as, subtle as the differences between American, Canadian, and British English. So it's like, 98% of the words are all the same. There's a few words here or there that are different, but everybody knows each other. And the thing is that we don't emphasize that these are separate languages. In the Balkans, unfortunately, newly emerging states must have their own language. So beforehand, where the language was just collectively called Serbo-Croatian, right now we have to distinguish Croatian from Serbian, from Bosnian, even Montenegrin. And part of this involved the use of an alphabet in which Serbian, quote-unquote Serbian, was seen to be exclusively used in the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, Serbs in Croatia have traditionally used the Latin alphabet. I mean, I know Serbs in Croatia, they can use Cyrillic, but they default to Latin. But because the law somehow required Cyrillic for whatever reason, this was seen as a symbol of Serbian nationalism. So Croatian nationalists decided to fight back. And so this sign here, Vukovar, a ne Vukovar, is basically a way of saying the town is called Vukovar in the Latin and not in the Cyrillic. And even here, I got to tell you, the spelling is off. If they wanted to call it Vukovar, this should be an extra B. So obviously, the Croatian nationalist knows a little Cyrillic, but not the whole thing here. And I mean, this produced for a while a backlash against the remaining Serbian minority, in which signs in Cyrillic were smashed. But not only that, memorials to Serbs that were killed in the wars in Croatia, the Serbian civilians or whatever, have been defaced, have been also knocked down. The Serbian community used to be anywhere from 12 to 15% in the early 90s. And then an ethnic cleansing campaign that followed, a protracted conflict resulted in anywhere between 150 to 250,000 Serbs being forced out of Croatia in basically a weekend. So the population goes from 12 to 15% to like 4 to 5%. And in those areas where Serbs still make up, some presence, right, these signs are basically indicative of the long-lasting animosities that were connected to the wars of the 1990s. So, you would think that, Croatia being in the European Union would somehow ameliorate this type of ethnocentrism. Not in the least. Serbs are still, I wouldn't say openly harassed in Croatia, but it's clear, it is very, very clear, right, that they are second-class citizens who need to be reminded that they are living in a thoroughly Croatian state. So we're not exactly talking about the type of civic inclusiveness that we would like to see in, Belgium or the Netherlands or, even to some extent the United States. So to finish out on this, and I don't want to focus just solely on one country, but I'd like to give a more broad example of the problems befalling multi-ethnic democratic transition, not in Yugoslavia, but in Romania. Now, much of the material that I'm going to cover here is taken from a book by Rogers Brubaker called Nationalist Politics and Everyday Ethnicity in a Transylvanian Town. It was published in 2006, so the material is, definitely not contemporary, but it gets the point across of what happens in the early years following the collapse of communism. And Transylvania is a great place to look at this because of its multi-ethnic and multicultural history. Historically, Transylvania, and beyond the pop cultural stuff of vampires and horror stories here, was historically part of the Kingdom of Hungary. It formed really one of the core territories of the Hungarian kingdom. And Transylvania was, by and large, multi-ethnic and multi-religious, with a certain sense of tiered communities. And, among a number of other groups, let's say I want to identify four big groups. The two groups at the top, historically, that, formed the bulk of the aristocratic and merchant classes were the Hungarians and what we call the Saxon Germans. So the Hungarians were the landed aristocracy, the big, land barons, the nobles. The Saxon Germans primarily lived in towns like Sibiu and Brașov and Timisoara and others. And both of them kind of formed the upper crust of an emerging, economic class, civil society. These were the intellectuals. A smaller group of people, and I need to bring them up, are the Serbs. And this was primarily within the Serbian Orthodox Church. This was a specific arrangement with what was then the Austrian Empire at the time to allow for an independent Serbian church to operate. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's one of the few Orthodox churches that were not only given permission to function with relative ease, but had Orthodox churches within towns and urban centers. Right? So one of the things that you'll note if you go to Romania is that within Transylvania and the neighboring region of Banat, if you go to the old town center of any of these places, and the one thing I love about Habsburg city planning is that it's all based on the same outline, right? So you go to the town square, and you're there, right? It's a big open area with like a Catholic church on one end, a statue of some saint or whatever in the middle. Sometimes it came with a fountain. A magistrate building on one end, a military barracks or an arsenal or a museum on the other, and maybe an Orthodox church. If you see an Orthodox church in, historically speaking, if you see an Orthodox church in a Transylvanian or Banat town, chances are it's almost always Serbian. Now, the bulk of the population were Romanian peasant farmers. And they had primarily lived in, villages, the outskirts of town, basically outside of urban centers. What Orthodox churches existed were usually within these smaller villages. So the towns were certainly built for people other than Romanians. So when the area becomes part of Romania following the First World War, right, there are efforts to Romanianize towns and cities that up to that point were overwhelmingly Hungarian or even German. So since the end of the First World War, and continued with certain vigor under the Ceausescu regime, efforts to Romanianize many of these previously multi-ethnic towns and cities have been part of Romanian political culture. And that's not to say that Romanian political culture itself is ethnocentric or racist, but that political actors have found it expedient, oftentimes opportunistic, to scapegoat the remaining Hungarian communities as being disloyal elements of the state. This certainly was exacerbated when parts of Transylvania were reincorporated into Hungary in the Second World War. And, following the collapse of communism in 1989, attempts by the Hungarian community to reassert their cultural institutional autonomy, which, I know, horrible for them to do this, right, were met with resistance by right-wing conservative leaders that once again felt it within their advantage to play the ethnic card. So what this shows is that minorities are targeted not because they're minorities, but because it's politically expedient for the area to somehow bring this up as a potential problem. And Well, look, let's take a look at the map here to get a sense of what we're talking about. If we understand minority communities in one state to look to their kin country across the border, Transylvania and Banat are right here, right, bordering both Serbia as well as Hungary, right? Transylvania was, up until a little over 100 years ago, as I mentioned, a core territory of the Hungarian kingdom. Hungarian was the primary language. The upper echelons of society were Hungarians. Romanians within this area were largely agrarian farmers. So when the area comes into the control of the rest of Romania at the time, efforts are made to kind of re-ethnicize the region from one group into another. But these strategies differ by location and political leadership. And so I want to focus on two cities here to look at, Timisoara and Cluj-Napoca. Timisoara is the regional capital of the Romanian Banat area. It is pretty much on the border with Serbia, and embraces its multi-ethnic history a little bit different from that of Cluj. There have been efforts at Romanianizing the city throughout much of the 20th century, but the German, Hungarian, and very small Serbian minority communities there were always seen to be part of the city, right? So even when I was there in 2008, there was a sense that Timisoara, which was overwhelmingly Romanian, never really had a problem with its non-Romanian past. And this is, I think, in no small part due to the events surrounding the Romanian uprising in 1989. The whole thing began over the controversial removal from office of a Hungarian pastor and attempts by the state security services to extract him from his home first met with resistance from the Hungarian communities, but very quickly enveloped the Romanian, Serbian, and German communities, who all came together not just to defend this Hungarian priest, but finally as a way of uniting against what they saw as the extremities of authoritarianism of the Ceausescu regime. So Timisoara very much has a multi-ethnic struggle even within the present period. Now, what that means, though, is efforts at Romanianizing the city are done not through direct antagonization of these other minorities. So a great way of looking at this is examining the old city square, right? The old square of Timisoara, the old Hungarian name Temesvar, which is also used by the Germans and the Serbian community. The name Temesvar is the non-Romanian name. You Google map Timisoara, and this city center is like the exact epicenter of the entire town. And it's got all the attributes that one could find, expect, and love of a Habsburg town center. The Catholic Church here has been here for at least 100, if not more, years, serving primarily the Hungarian and also the small, dwindling, but still visibly present German community. Now, on the opposite end, you've got an Orthodox Church, which, as I said, is Serbian. It's not Romanian, because Romanians did not make up any major demographics within the towns. They remained largely within the countrysides. But as we note here, right, the town square is very much indicative of the city's pre-Romanian heritage, right? All the major landmarks focus on other groups. So what happens when these towns become part of Romania? Efforts are simply made to create a new town square, right? Not to demolish the old, not to appropriate the old, but simply to move the center of the town someplace else. And the new city center, which is overwhelmingly Romanian, includes, right, the same type of things. Some, art buildings, some opera house, some magistrate building, but the only church is going to be a Romanian Orthodox church. And it's this huge Romanian cathedral, which was built between, I think, the 20s and the 30s, right? So this is not an old church at all. It's maybe about 100 years old, because remember, Romanian churches, especially of this size, did not exist within major city centers. So the efforts to kind of Romanianize Timisoara is just simply moving the town center someplace else. Even though today, geographically speaking, the old town center is still right dab smack in the middle. The thing is that you've got two town squares. One that's, I think, more open to the public, and then the old town square is, I think, becoming more and more touristy, right? Some high-end hotels, some really nice restaurants and cafes. It's not deserted by any stretch of the imagination, but what is just simply done is a way of creating a town square in which Romanians are the predominant culture. Now, things are a little bit more different, a little bit more difficult and confrontational, particularly in the 90s. So mind you, this is, about 25 years ago. In Cluj-Napoca, which as you can see in this image here, some Hungarian decided to put the old name Koloszvar on it. Now, there's a couple of reasons why. Antagonisms of minorities tend to be more prominent in Cluj and the larger Transylvanian area than in Timisoara. One of which is following the death of Ceausescu, Hungarians were much more visible, organized, and politically mobile than they were in Banat. And, one of the first things that we see following, New Year's 1990 were efforts by the Hungarian community to regain institutional and or cultural autonomy. And this kind of fell into a couple of rationales. The Hungarian demographics were dwindling throughout the Cold War period, right? Many had just packed up and left. But there still were sizable communities in a few Transylvanian towns, including the one town of Târgu-Mureș, which actually had a Hungarian plurality, right? So it was one of the few places that was seen by both Hungarians and Romanians as like this last bastion of, Magyar identity. And it is within these towns where we find greater efforts at moving that minority consciousness into some kind of political mobility, especially with the establishment of the Democratic Alliance of Hungarians of Romania, which was both a civic as well as a political organization that sought restitution of confiscated property and assets, the return of some degrees of cultural pluralism, especially the reinstating of Hungarian universities, particularly Babis-Bolyai University, which previously had taught within the Hungarian language. So efforts were made by, DAR, we'll just call it, by its acronym, to return to some of the, cultural autonomy that the Hungarians had enjoyed. This, unfortunately, was met with opposition by many Romanian leaders, especially those within the conservative right, which had interpreted this, again, no evidence to suggest that irredentism existed, but for political expediency, hey, it works. But this is Hungarian irredentism. That this is efforts by agents within Budapest to seize control over as much of Transylvania as possible, just like they did in the World War II period. And these narratives, which were largely pushed by right-wing conservative movements like Vatra Romanesca, Romanian Hearth, were picked up and turned into political practice by the then mayor of the city of Cluj, Gheorghe Funar, who took it upon himself to become this do-it-yourself crusader for Romanian identity and heritage in a city that was previously overwhelmingly Hungarian, but was going to be his mission to prove that whatever Hungarian identity existed in the city was built on pre-existing Romanian identities. And so this plays into, this continued policy of Romanianizing Transylvania as much as possible. So this is not necessarily a particular thing of post-communism, but had been an ongoing initiative pretty much since 1920. And this, of course, reflects a number of things. First of all, the demographic changes of Transylvania are overwhelmingly in Romania's favor. Germans had by and large packed up and left after 1990. The German government in Berlin had extended citizenship to all ethnic Germans of Eastern Europe. If they wanted to, they could file the paperwork to relocate, to repatriate back to Germany. Many Germans of the former Soviet Union followed suit. Almost all the Saxon Germans of Romania eventually left as well. So that basically reduced Romanian minorities primarily to that of Hungarians. And those that remained chose to remain and tried as much as possible to regain as much institutional, cultural autonomy as possible. This, of course, leads to the response by many Romanian politicians to continue pushing, right, for the Romanianization. Adjusting landmarks, recentering, city centers, doing basically what Timisoara had done beginning in the 1920s and 30s, right? So we see kind of this grand construction projects of new Romanian city centers that move the attention away from the old historical Hungarian and Habsburg. And part of this, right, also involves looking into the history of the Romanian people within Transylvania as a way of showing that they are the original inhabitants of a land that is overwhelmingly landmarked with, Hungarian identity. And part of this, and this is not anything new in the 90s, but was, picked up from earlier, scholarly efforts, is what I call the Dacian narrative, right? The area of Transylvania within the Roman period was known as Dacia, Dacia, however way you want to refer to it. And the understanding is that the Romanians of the area are basically descended from the ancient Dacian tribes. They adopted the Latin language. They adopted sort of Roman, mannerisms during their time when the area was under the control of the empire under the Emperor Trajan. Right. So there are links to Imperial Rome. There are links to classical Europe. But most importantly, this Dacian narrative is meant to predate the arrival of Transylvania's biggest claimant, biggest competitor, the Hungarians. Right, so if one goes to Transylvania, you can see landmarks and castles and monuments and city names and everything that's overwhelmingly Hungarian, but the facts are clear. Hungarians only moved into the area around the year 1000 AD. The goal among the Romanians is simply to say, if the Hungarians say that they've been here for 900 years, all we have to do is show that we've been here for 1,000, because we're the original inhabitants. And in this case, right, this helps to rectify what some Romanians felt as the injustice of Transylvanian history, in which the indigenous population was moved to the bottom of the socio-political and socio-cultural hierarchy. Now, the Germans had largely left, and the Serbs were, less than 5%. And relations between Romania and Serbia have always been good. But the Hungarians are that sizable minority that feel aggrieved and don't buy into new Romanian political culture. So the response by the majority is to somehow translate existing narratives of victimhood and discrimination under the old Hungarian system as justifications for historical ownership today. And while that didn't involve openly harassing, intimidating, or attacking Hungarians, right? We don't see the same thing in, Yugoslavia as we saw, as we see in Romania. The idea is to resist as much as possible efforts by the Hungarian community to obtain as much institutional autonomy as possible. So the understanding here is very simple within a multi-ethnic democratizing framework. Who was here first? Medieval Hungary or Roman Dacia? And even though the links between modern-day Romania and the old Roman-era tribes are more myth than history, it proves one point, right? We were here first. So the Hungarians are kind of the invaders, and the true people that should control the region are the Romanians. And within that, there's a whole bunch of other arguments that are brought up, particularly medieval leaders like Matthias Corvinus, who, up until this point was regarded as a Hungarian king, a Hungarian noble. Why? He spoke Hungarian. He identified with the Hungarian aristocracy. But the narrative within the Romanian collective memories is that Matthias Corvinus may actually have been a Romanian. And, someone who ascends the ladder of power and privilege, before modern day politics become a thing, the higher up the echelons you went, you ended up adopting the language and the mannerisms of the predominant class. So as I mentioned a slide or two beforehand, right? The predominant demographics of Transylvania were Hungarian. The language was Hungarian, but that was the language of commerce, of privilege and power. And especially in the old feudal period, one could have been anyone, but ascending the ranks eventually majorizes somebody, right? So the idea here is that Matthias Corvinus may actually be one of our own boys, according to Romanian, political culture, which is great because we take all the attributes of Corvinus, all the accomplishments, all the castles, all this, all that, but instead of attributing that to Hungarian history, that's part of Romanian history as well. And of course, this creates all sorts of arguments in comment sections between Romanians and Hungarians. Look, at the same time, there was no evidence whatsoever of Hungarian separatism, right? The most vocal that you're going to get for independence of Hungarian lands outside of Hungary is largely coming from the diaspora, mostly here in New Jersey. But however fictitious it might have been, it played nicely into the political rhetoric at the time among Romanian conservatives that, today they're asking for linguistic autonomy, tomorrow they'll be asking for regional autonomy, and that will just simply provide a slippery slope to eventually being claimed and annexed by Hungary. Were these claims real? Were they imagined? The bigger question is, does it matter? It doesn't matter. What matters is simply creating a narrative and fueling a sense of paranoia that it's up to the current Romanian leadership now to diffuse as much Hungarian cultural heritage in the area as possible to prevent it from being taken away, right? That was basically the idea here. And so that's where we begin to look at the city of Cluj, now with the suffix added, Cluj-Napoca, which historically was the old Hungarian city of Koloszvar. The name was changed to Cluj following the First World War. Recently, the suffix Napoca was added to give it some kind of link to the alleged name of the settlement that had existed back in the Roman period before the Hungarians had arrived, right? And so one of the things that you're going to find in this region, in Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, is that a lot of the current towns and cities have, names that are, Slavic, Turkish, whatever. A lot of them were, in some ways, pre-existing Roman settlements. So, for instance, Belgrade's original name was Singidunum. The town of Niš in southern Serbia was originally called Nisus. And apparently, Cluj-Koloszvar was originally called Napoca. So as a way of trying to make that link to the old Dacian, period, the name of the city is now Cluj-Napoca, which is another way of trying to show that the city predates any Koloszvarian, influences. So this is a picture of the old city center, right? Same thing that we find in Timisoara, right? Attempts to just create a new city center away from what was overwhelmingly Hungarian and German. The primary church, St. Michael's, is a Hungarian Catholic church, if I'm not mistaken, including the statue right in the middle here, as you can see, of Matthias Corvinus, right? So this is, Hungarian cultural center right here. There is, no indication that, Romanian identity is involved. But once the city becomes increasingly incorporated within the Romanian state, efforts are made to de-emphasize the uniqueness of Hungarian identity. And this picture that I showed you beforehand, there is this big sign that it's in front of the church that is written in two languages, Romanian and English, not Hungarian, not German, but just English, in that archaeological excavations are being taken place around the church because of evidence of, Roman-era settlements. So we're talking about, pottery and fragments and this and that. But this is a way of basically showing that the big Hungarian landmark of the city is built on directly over pre-existing Dacian equaling Romanian settlements. So Cluj is a Romanian city before it kind of took a temporary detour by being a major center of Hungarian and German civilization. We see the then mayor, Funar, right here, giving some kind of talk, some kind of dedication. And, there is this understanding of the city's multi-ethnic composition, the EU flag, the Romanian flag, and the Hungarian flag. But there he is with a sash over his suit with the Romanian colors. In fact, let me go back here and say that one of the big things that he did in trying to just subtly Romanianize the city was putting up all of these signs and other elements within the Romanian colors of the flag. So you might think to yourself, this is a weird color combination here. Why is that? The Romanian flag, blue, yellow, and red. Same thing here with his sash, right? Blue, yellow, and red. And amid that time were efforts at creating a new city center, a brand new city center with another colossal Romanian Orthodox church at one end, and one that was shorn of its pre-1920 heritage, right? One that does not have indicators specifically of Hungarian, but also, if necessary, German influences. So the buildings are kind of neo-Baroque. The monuments are to Romanian heroes and historical figures, and the churches, which, as I said, previously were not Romanian Orthodox, are now front and center at these squares and are bigger than life, right? And this is kind of a thing within Eastern Europe following the end of communism, efforts by a lot of these countries to create these colossal, like Hagia Sophia-size churches throughout the countryside. Back to Funar's period, right, we see efforts at reminding the Hungarian community about where they are. This is the Hungarian consulate within Cluj. The flag is there. Funar decided it would be great to put Romanian flags on both sides. Why? Just because. And, one is not enough, but we need four to almost counter the, the red, white, and green colors here. But even, things getting as silly as painting park benches, the colors of the flag, to trash receptacles as well, right? So it's just, Romanian tricolor, symbols and indicators everywhere one goes, with signs saying, this area here might be some archaeological site, that area there is undergoing investigation, right? So the whole idea is that, on top of the current city of Cluj is the settlement of Napoca, right? And this is what we're going to do. We're going to show that this is, a city with a deep sense of history, which, yes, there is a big chapter that includes Hungarians, but the Hungarians are an interlude. And the city was and is Romanian, specifically Romanian. So what does that tell us about certain approaches to multi-ethnic democratization? This only skims the surface. Of course, we haven't looked at more specific examples within the former Yugoslavia just yet. But if we could take this into sort of a larger theoretical observation, multi-ethnic transition provides additional challenges in finding collective consensus in post-authoritarian rule. In other words, an ethnically homogeneous state may very well engage in the same type of ethnocentrism, historical revisionism, and cultural chauvinism, right? That's clear as day, as we saw in Central Europe. But without a minority to feel aggrieved and resist, a lot of these efforts go unnoticed. But ethnically homogeneous states are more rare than common, and most countries undergoing transformation, whether it's the Middle East, Latin America, Southeast Asia, even the United States today, which is increasingly multi-ethnic, multiracial, we find that narratives of democratization more often than not don't include minority groups, or to simply assume that minority groups need to assimilate or, they're included just by proxy. But the thing is that rarely happens because the dominant group is going to feel the pressure that cultural self-determination is really a natural fit for groups, emerging from decades of communist rule and multi-ethnic federalism. So in other words, thinking that a minority is just simply going to go along with your political culture is horribly naive, especially if that minority is differentiated by a distinctive language, a different religion, certainly different historical and collective memories from that of the primary group. And the thing is that the primary group is still going to look to culture, especially in the immediate years following de-authoritarianization, because they serve as ready-made resources for emerging states and societies. Right? If the group is trying to de-Marxify, de-Leninize the country, right? We're getting rid of the statues, we're getting rid of the Soviet version of historical memory. Well, what is there to replace it? Now, it's very rare that you have political actors decide now's the moment to kind of create a new narrative. So, let's invite the Hungarians to a proverbial round table. Or, hey, the Albanians of Kosovo are getting restless. Let's sit down with the Albanian political leaders and try to carve out a new Kosovo that is inclusive of both Serbs and Albanians. Or, hey, the Serbs are feeling aggrieved with the constitutional nationalism of Croatia. Let's reach out to the Serbian community and assure them that they have just as much of a say in the new Croatia as possible. I mean, that just doesn't happen, unfortunately. What ends up happening, there might be some reformers within the predominant group that might think this is what should happen. But before any initiative is made to reach out to them, extremists and hardliners within the group are going to look at these minorities and say that they are powered, galvanized, mobilized, paid for, through homeland nationalism by their cross-border countries. So they're automatically going to be seen as unwanted elements within the states that need to be either reminded that they are now minorities in another country, or that age-old additive, if you don't like it, you can get out, right? We'll gas up the bus for you. So, of course, competing narratives, opposition from minority communities towards encroaching, predominant elements of culture are going to be met with antagonism. And if this is seen as something that can be galvanized and exploited by current political actors, then that's exactly what's going to happen. Ethnic political conflict might draw from the past. So the Hungarians of Romania might be seen as, the descendants of collaborators in the Second World War. Serbs in Croatia might be seen as agents of greater Serbian nationalism. Albanians might be seen as terrorists from, neighboring Albania. But these perceptions are very much contemporary socio-political and socio-cultural problems, exacerbated in no small measure by people in power, which, sort of tells us why some groups are targeted and aggrieved while others are not, right? So it really is not a case of just systemic racism, xenophobia, and intolerance, right? It's not a case of Balkan ghosts that so permeated the discourse in the 90s, but it's more of a situation of what can I as a political actor gain by either reaching across the aisle to that minority or working to scapegoat that minority. Yeah, but what it does show, and this is what I want to end on, is that democratic transition in multi-ethnic societies doesn't have to be problematic, but if it is, there is a very good chance that the conflict is stoked, exploited, and exacerbated by people in power. That's not to say that local level mistrust and animosity doesn't exist, but without any kind of political mobilization or some kind of condonement of activity, resentment and fears are going to just be that. There's not going to be open hostility. There's not going to be any kind of open conflict. So to suggest that democratic transition in Balkan countries following the collapse of communism was doomed to fail because everybody is racist is wrong. For every group that fought with another group, one of those two groups got along relatively okay with a third group. And why is that? Again, there's lots of hypotheses, but one that I think sticks is the choices made by people in power to either antagonize one group or to let the other one go.